The stars had always watched Earth in silence, and for 300 years, Earth watched them back the same way. Humanity had learned patience in a way that no other species in the known galaxy ever had. They had learned it through blood and fire and the near destruction of their own world. They had learned it through wars that killed millions and plagues that killed more. They had learned it through the slow, painful process of almost ending themselves not once, not twice, but dozens of times throughout their history. By the time the first alien signal reached Earth in the year 2147, humanity had already been through enough to know that rushing into anything was a mistake. The signal came from a region of space approximately 47 light-years away, from a system that human astronomers had been studying for decades. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was not random noise. It was a clear, structured transmission that contained mathematical sequences, astronomical coordinates, and what could only be described as a greeting. The world changed overnight. Religions struggled to reconcile their teachings with the reality of extraterrestrial life. Governments convened emergency sessions that lasted for weeks. Scientists celebrated and debated and argued about what this meant for human understanding of the universe. Ordinary people looked up at the night sky and wondered if they were about to meet their new neighbors or their future conquerors. The United Nations established the Terran Contact Authority within 6 months of receiving the signal. This new organization was tasked with coordinating humanity's response to the alien transmission. They spent 2 years carefully analyzing every aspect of the signal before they even considered sending a reply. Dr. Samuel Wright was one of the lead scientists on the project. He was a quiet man in his 50s with gray hair that had once been brown and tired eyes that had seen too many late nights in laboratories and conference rooms. He had dedicated his entire career to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and now that they had finally found it, he felt more afraid than excited. "We need to be careful," he told the assembly of world leaders who had gathered to discuss their response. "We know nothing about these beings. We do not know their intentions. We do not know their capabilities. We do not know if they are friendly or hostile or simply indifferent to our existence." "But we cannot simply ignore them," argued the Chinese representative. "They have reached out to us. To not respond would be rude at best and potentially provocative at worst." "I am not suggesting we ignore them," Samuel replied. "I am suggesting we take our time. We should observe. We should learn. We should gather as much information as possible before we commit ourselves to any course of action." This became the foundation of what would later be known as the Quiet Doctrine. Humanity would respond to the alien signal, but they would do so carefully, cautiously, and with the understanding that they were dealing with forces far beyond their current comprehension. The response was sent in 2150, 3 years after the initial signal was received. It was a simple message, an acknowledgement of receipt, a mathematical proof of intelligence, and a polite request for more information about the senders. The reply came much faster than anyone expected. It arrived in 2151, meaning that whoever had sent it possessed technology capable of faster-than-light communication. This was humanity's first indication that they were dealing with a civilization far more advanced than their own. The message introduced the senders as representatives of the Interstellar Assembly, a coalition of over 400 spacefaring species that had existed for more than 40,000 years. The Assembly, the message explained, was responsible for maintaining peace and order throughout the galaxy. They welcomed humanity to the cosmic community and extended an invitation for Earth to join their organization as a probationary member. The word probationary caught Samuel's attention immediately. "What do they mean by that?" he asked during the emergency meeting that followed the message's arrival. "What are the conditions of this probation? What happens if we fail to meet their standards?" These questions were posed in humanity's next transmission, and the answers they received were not encouraging. The Interstellar Assembly operated on a strict hierarchy. At the top were the founding species, ancient civilizations that had been spacefaring for tens of thousands of years. Below them were the established members, species that had proven their worth over centuries of membership. Below them were the junior members, relatively new additions who had demonstrated their commitment to assembly values. And at the very bottom were the probationary members, newly contacted species who had not yet proven themselves worthy of full participation. Probationary members had no voting rights in the Assembly Council. They were required to accept assembly oversight of their technological development. They were forbidden from expanding beyond their home system without assembly approval. They were expected to contribute resources and labor to assembly projects, and they were subject to corrective intervention if they failed to comply with assembly directives. "They are asking us to become their servants," said the Russian representative during the heated debate that followed. "This is not an invitation to join a community of equals. This is a demand that we submit to their rule." "We cannot refuse," argued the Brazilian representative. "They are clearly far more advanced than we are. If we reject their offer, they might decide to force the issue. Or they might respect our decision and leave us alone," countered the Indian representative. "We do not know enough about them to predict their response." Samuel listened to the arguments for hours before finally speaking up. "I propose a third option," he said. "We neither accept nor refuse. We acknowledge their invitation, express our appreciation for their offer, and politely decline to make a decision at this time. We tell them that we need more time to consider such an important matter." "How much time?" asked the American representative. "As much as they will give us," Samuel replied. "Decades if possible, centuries if we can manage it." This was the beginning of humanity's 300-year silence. The response to the Assembly's invitation was carefully crafted by a team of linguists, diplomats, and psychologists. It expressed gratitude for the offer of membership. It acknowledged the Assembly's long history and impressive achievements. It conveyed humanity's deep respect for the cosmic community they had been invited to join. And it concluded with a humble request for time to prepare themselves for such a momentous step. The Assembly's response was surprisingly understanding. They had encountered this reaction before, they explained. Many newly contacted species felt overwhelmed by the sudden revelation that they were not alone in the universe. They were happy to give humanity time to adjust. They would check in periodically to see if Earth was ready to proceed with the membership process. And so the waiting began. The first assembly delegation arrived in Earth orbit in 2156. Their ship was enormous, a vessel nearly 3 kilometers long that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. It hung in the darkness above the planet like a small moon, visible to the naked eye from the surface below. Ambassador Al was the leader of this delegation. He was a species that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a spider. He stood nearly 3 meters tall on 6 segmented legs, with a torso that rose up to support 4 arms and a head dominated by large, multifaceted eyes that seemed to see everything at once. They were one of the elder species of the Assembly, members for over 30,000 years. They had been assigned to oversee humanity's transition into galactic society, a task they had performed for hundreds of other species before. Al's first meeting with human representatives took place aboard his vessel. A small shuttle carried a delegation of 12 humans up from the surface, including Samuel Wright, who had been appointed as Earth's primary liaison to the Assembly. The interior of the ship was unlike anything the humans had ever seen. The corridors were too tall and too narrow, designed for beings with a very different body shape. The lighting was dim and had a strange purple tint that made human eyes strain. The air was breathable but carried unfamiliar scents that triggered ancient instincts of unease. Al received them in a chamber that might have been designed for diplomacy or might have been his personal quarters. It was impossible to tell. The furniture, if it could be called that, consisted of strange geometric shapes that the humans could not figure out how to sit on. "Welcome," Al said through a translation device that turned his clicks and whistles into passable English. "I am pleased to meet the representatives of Terra. Your species has shown remarkable promise." "Thank you, Ambassador," Samuel replied. "We are honored by your visit." "I have come to assess your readiness for membership in the Assembly," Al continued. "This is a standard procedure for all probationary candidates. I will be observing your civilization, meeting with your leaders, and preparing a report for the Council." "We understand," Samuel said carefully. "However, as we indicated in our previous communication, we do not yet feel ready to commit to membership. We are still processing the implications of contact with extraterrestrial intelligence." Al's compound eyes flickered in what might have been amusement or annoyance. It was impossible to read his alien expression. "This is common," he said. "Many species experience what you might call culture shock when they first learn of the Assembly. We are patient. We have time." The delegation spent 2 weeks on the vessel, learning about the Assembly and its history. Al was an attentive host, answering their questions thoroughly and providing access to a vast database of information about galactic civilization. What the humans learned disturbed them deeply. The Assembly was not the benevolent organization it presented itself as. It was an empire in all but name, ruled by a small group of ancient species who had positioned themselves at the top of a rigid hierarchy. Member worlds that with Assembly directives were rewarded with access to advanced technology and trade networks. Those that resisted were subjected to economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and in extreme cases, military intervention. The Assembly's history was littered with examples of species that had been corrected for various infractions. Some had been stripped of their spacefaring capabilities and confined to their home worlds. Others had been absorbed into larger member states, their cultures and identities erased over generations. A few had simply disappeared from the records entirely, their fates left unmentioned. Samuel compiled all of this information and presented it to the Terran Contact Authority upon his return to Earth. "They are not asking us to join a community," he said during his briefing. "They are asking us to submit to an empire. If we accept their terms, we will lose control of our own destiny. Our technological development will be monitored and restricted. Our expansion into space will be controlled. Our resources will be taxed, and if we ever step out of line, we will be punished." "But if we refuse, we risk provoking them," argued General Moore, the military representative on the authority. "You said yourself that their technology is far beyond ours. If they decide to force the issue, we would not be able to resist." "Then we must prepare," Samuel replied. "Not for war, but for independence. We must develop our own capabilities quietly, without attracting their attention. We must become strong enough that the cost of forcing us to comply would outweigh the benefits." "How long would that take?" asked the authority's chairman. Samuel had done the calculations. The gap between human technology and Assembly technology was vast. Based on what he had learned from Al's database, it would take humanity at least 2 to 3 centuries to reach parity with the more advanced Assembly species, assuming they could sustain rapid technological development without interference. 300 years, he said, give or take a few decades. The chairman stared at him in disbelief. "You are asking us to plan for a period longer than most nations have existed." "I am asking us to plan for our survival as an independent species," Samuel replied. "The Assembly thinks in terms of, if we want to deal with them as equals, we must learn to do the same." This was the moment when humanity committed itself to the quiet doctrine. The decision was made in secret, shared only among the highest levels of government, and passed down through generations of leaders who understood what was at stake. Publicly, Earth continued to engage with the Assembly in friendly but noncommittal terms. Diplomatic missions were exchanged. Cultural programs were established. Trade negotiations were conducted, though they never seemed to reach a final agreement. Every time the Assembly pressed for a decision on membership, humanity found a new reason to delay. The excuses became an art form over the decades. Earth was still recovering from its history of internal conflicts. Earth needed more time to educate its population about galactic civilization. Earth was experiencing a religious revival that required careful management. Earth was in the middle of a political transition that made long-term commitments impossible. The Assembly was patient at first, then confused, then frustrated. Ambassador Al made dozens of visits over the course of his long career, each time expecting to finally secure humanity's commitment to membership, each time departing with nothing but polite assurances that a decision would be made soon. "I do not understand your species," he told Samuel during one of their later meetings. Samuel was old now, well past 80, while Al showed no signs of aging at all. They lived for thousands of years, a fact that had not been included in the initial information package. "You have been given an unprecedented opportunity. No other species in recorded history has been offered so much time to consider membership, and yet you continue to hesitate." "We are a cautious people," Samuel replied. "We have learned through bitter experience that rushing into commitments often leads to regret." "What do you fear? The Assembly brings only benefits to its members. Technology, trade, protection, knowledge. These are gifts beyond measure." Samuel looked at the alien ambassador with eyes that had seen too much in his long life. "We fear losing ourselves," he said simply. "We have spent thousands of years building our civilization. We have made mistakes, terrible ones, but we have also created things of beauty and value. We are not ready to surrender all of that to become just another probationary member in your hierarchy." Al was silent for a long moment. "You speak as if you have a choice," he finally said. "No species has ever refused the Assembly indefinitely. Eventually, all come to understand that resistance is pointless." "Perhaps we will be the first," Samuel replied. It was the last conversation they ever had. Samuel died 3 months later, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 84. His work was continued by his successors, generation after generation of leaders who understood the long game humanity was playing. While the diplomats stalled, the scientists worked. The Quiet Protocol began in 2167, 20 years after first contact. It was humanity's greatest secret, a project so classified that even most world leaders did not know the full extent of what was being developed. The project had 3 primary objectives. First, to develop faster-than-light travel independent of assembly technology. Second, to create a surveillance network capable of monitoring assembly activities across the galaxy. Third, to design defensive systems that could neutralize assembly weapons without causing casualties. Each of these objectives required breakthroughs that conventional science said were impossible. Faster-than-light travel violated the laws of physics as humanity understood them. A galaxy-wide surveillance network would require resources beyond anything Earth possessed, and defensive systems capable of stopping assembly weapons would need to be centuries ahead of anything humanity had ever built. But humanity had one advantage that the Assembly had never considered: desperation. The scientists working on the Quiet Protocol were driven by the knowledge that failure meant extinction. Not the quick, dramatic extinction of a military conquest, but the slow, grinding extinction of cultural absorption. They had seen what happened to species that joined the Assembly on probationary terms. They had read the histories, studied the patterns, and understood that joining the Assembly meant the eventual death of everything that made humanity unique. This fear pushed them to work harder than any scientists in human history had ever worked. They slept in their laboratories. They sacrificed their personal lives. They died young from overwork and stress, and their successors picked up where they left off without complaint. The first breakthrough came in 2203, when Dr. Maria Santos discovered a flaw in the conventional understanding of faster-than-light physics. The assembly had provided humanity with the basic principles of their FTL technology as part of the standard probationary information package. But the information was incomplete, deliberately so. The assembly did not share the full details of FTL travel with probationary members, keeping them dependent on assembly vessels for interstellar transportation. Maria was a theoretical physicist with a gift for seeing patterns that others missed. She spent 15 years studying the incomplete equations the assembly had provided, looking for inconsistencies that might reveal what was being hidden. When she finally found it, she reportedly laughed so hard that her colleagues thought she had lost her mind. "They lied to us," she told them when she had calmed down enough to explain. "Not directly, but by omission. The equations they gave us are correct, but they are not the only way to achieve faster-than-light travel. There is another method, one that their equations specifically avoid mentioning." The alternative method was more difficult to implement than the assembly's technology, but it had one crucial advantage. It did not require any of the rare materials that the assembly controlled. Humanity could build FTL engines using resources available in their own solar system. The first human-built FTL vessel, the Pathfinder, launched in 2231. It was a small ship, barely large enough for a crew of 5, but it represented humanity's first true step toward independence. The Pathfinder traveled to Alpha and back in less than a week, a journey that would have taken conventional vessels thousands of years. The test was conducted in complete secrecy. As far as the assembly knew, humanity was still confined to their home system, dependent on assembly vessels for any interstellar travel. The second breakthrough came in 2247, when engineer Tony perfected the design for what he called a listener. It was a probe no larger than a grain of sand, powered by a miniature fusion reactor, and equipped with sensors capable of detecting electromagnetic radiation across the entire spectrum. Each listener could receive and transmit data across interstellar distances using the same principles that powered the human FTL drives. The listeners were designed to be undetectable by assembly sensors. They were too small, too quiet, and operated on frequencies that the assembly had never thought to monitor. They could be deployed in the millions, spreading through space like dust, recording everything they encountered and transmitting it back to Earth. The first generation of listeners was deployed in 2250. Within a decade, there were billions of them spread throughout assembly space, silently watching, silently learning, silently waiting. The third breakthrough was the most difficult. Creating defensive systems capable of neutralizing assembly weapons required understanding exactly how those weapons worked. This meant infiltrating assembly military installations, stealing classified technical data, and reverse engineering technology that humanity was not supposed to possess. This task fell to a new generation of operatives trained specifically for this purpose. They were chosen young, modified with subtle biological and technological enhancements that made them undetectable by standard assembly security measures, and sent out into the galaxy with cover identities that could withstand any level of scrutiny. One of these operatives was a woman named Grace Parker. She was born in 2278, the granddaughter of one of the original Quiet Protocol scientists. She had been raised from childhood to serve humanity's secret cause, trained in languages, combat, infiltration, and the art of appearing to be something she was not. Grace's mission was to infiltrate the Science Directorate, the organization responsible for developing new technologies for the assembly. She spent 3 years building her cover identity, a human hybrid who had been raised on a border world and had come to Prime seeking educational opportunities. The cover worked. Grace was accepted into the Directorate's division, where she spent the next 7 years quietly copying data and transmitting it back to Earth through a network of listeners she had deployed in the system. The information she gathered was invaluable. Assembly weapons, she learned, were based on a technology called directed plasma resonance. They worked by creating a sustained reaction that generated enormous amounts of energy in a focused beam. The beams were powerful enough to destroy starships, and there was no known defense against them. But Grace discovered something the Assembly did not know. The directed plasma resonance had a critical weakness. The reaction could be disrupted by a specific frequency of exotic particles that occurred naturally in certain rare stellar phenomena. If humanity could find a way to generate these particles artificially, they could neutralize assembly weapons without firing a shot. She transmitted this information to Earth in 2312 and then disappeared. The Assembly never found her. She made her way back to human space through a series of carefully planned jumps, using hidden FTL relays that had been placed throughout the galaxy by previous operatives. When she finally arrived on Earth, she was 51 years old and had spent more than half her life living among aliens, pretending to be something she was not. She was debriefed by the Terran Security Council and then given the choice to retire or continue serving. She chose to continue. There was too much work still to be done. The exotic particle generator was developed over the next 20 years, based on the data Grace had provided. It was tested for the first time in 2334 on an isolated asteroid in the outer solar system. A captured assembly weapon was fired at a target, and the generator successfully disrupted the plasma resonance, causing the beam to dissipate harmlessly. The scientists celebrated quietly. They had done it. After nearly 2 centuries of work, humanity finally had the means to defend itself against the Assembly's weapons. But having the means and using them were two different things. The Terran Council knew that revealing their capabilities would immediately trigger a response from the Assembly. They were not yet ready for open confrontation. They needed more time to prepare, more time to build, more time to spread their network of listeners and defensive systems throughout the galaxy. So they continued to wait, continued to stall, continued to play the part of a primitive species too overwhelmed by the universe to make decisions. The Assembly grew increasingly frustrated with humanity's delays, but they were reluctant to force the issue. They had invested centuries in humanity's eventual membership, and they were not willing to admit that their efforts had failed. They were too focused on their own scientific pursuits to care much about one stubborn species on the edge of the galaxy, and the other member species had their own concerns to deal with. Besides, humanity posed no threat. They were confined to their home system, had no FTL capability of their own, and showed no signs of developing the technology necessary to challenge assembly dominance. They were simply an annoyance, a minor irritation in the smooth functioning of galactic civilization. This was exactly what humanity wanted them to believe. By the year 2400, 253 years after first contact, humanity had expanded to 12 star systems. Their colonies were hidden, built on worlds and moons that the Assembly had classified as uninhabitable or uninteresting. Their ships traveled through space using routes that avoided Assembly patrols, communicating through networks of listeners that the Assembly did not know existed. The population of human space had grown to nearly 50 billion people, all of them raised with the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. The quiet doctrine was taught in schools, discussed in homes, and reinforced through every aspect of human culture. Every citizen understood that they were playing a role in a drama that had begun before their grandparents were born and would continue long after they were dead. And still, Earth continued to smile and nod and delay whenever the Assembly came calling. Ambassador Al had retired by then, replaced by a younger named X who had even less patience for human procrastination. X made it clear during his first visit to Earth that the Assembly was running out of tolerance. "Your species has been given 3 centuries to make a decision," he said to the current human liaison, a woman named Admiral Cole. "This is unprecedented. No other species has been shown such patience. The Council is beginning to question whether humanity is capable of making the transition to galactic citizenship. Was 63 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, studying the Assembly, learning their psychology, understanding their weaknesses. She knew that X's threat was real, but she also knew that humanity was nearly ready. "We appreciate the Assembly's patience," she said calmly. "We are making progress toward a decision. Perhaps within the next few decades, we will be ready to commit." A few decades. X's compound eyes flickered with what might have been anger. "You cannot be serious. The Council will not accept more delays. You must give us an answer within the year, or we will be forced to consider alternative approaches." "Alternative approaches?" asked, her voice still calm. "There are those on the Council who believe that humanity would benefit from a more direct form of guidance," X replied. "If you cannot make the transition to galactic citizenship on your own, perhaps you need assistance." Understood what he was saying. The Assembly was threatening to intervene directly in human affairs, to force humanity into membership whether they wanted it or not. It was a threat that had been made before, but never so openly. She smiled, a cold expression that showed no fear. "I will convey your message to our leaders," she said. "We will have an answer for you soon." After X departed, immediately contacted the Terran Security Council. The situation was accelerating faster than they had anticipated. They had hoped for another 50 years of preparation, but it seemed they would have to make do with what they had. The Council convened in emergency session, a gathering of the most powerful people in human civilization. They represented every major nation, every major faction, every significant interest group. They had their differences, their conflicts, their competing agendas, but on this one issue, they were united. "The Assembly is preparing to force our hand," reported. "Ambassador X made it clear that they will not accept any more delays. If we do not give them an answer within the year, they will intervene directly." "Then we give them an answer," said General Robert Hayes, the commander of Terran Defense Forces. "We tell them no." "And if they respond with force?" asked President Carter, a quiet man who had been elected specifically because of his expertise in. "Then we show them what we have been building for the past 300 years, Robert replied. "We show them that we are not the primitive species they think we are. We show them that forcing us to comply would cost them more than they are willing to pay." The Council debated for hours, but in the end, the decision was unanimous. Humanity would continue to delay as long as possible, but they would also begin preparing for the possibility of open confrontation. The defensive networks would be activated. The hidden fleets would be placed on standby. The listeners would begin transmitting tactical data in real time. And if the Assembly crossed the line, if they actually fired on a human vessel or attacked a human world, humanity would respond with everything they had. The year that followed was the tensest in human history. Every day brought new demands from the Assembly, new threats, new warnings about the consequences of continued delay. Met with X repeatedly, each time finding new ways to postpone the final decision without actually refusing outright. But everyone knew that the end was coming. The Assembly was running out of patience, and humanity was running out of excuses. The crisis finally came in early 2447, 300 years after first contact. A human scientific vessel named Horizon's Edge had been conducting a survey of an unclaimed system on the edge of human space. The system had been chosen specifically because it was far from any Assembly territory, a safe location for research without risk of detection. But the Assembly had expanded its territorial claims since the last time humanity had updated their maps. The system that had been unclaimed 50 years ago was now considered space, at least according to Assembly records. Admiral Cole was aboard the Horizon's Edge when the patrol arrived. She had been inspecting the ship's research facilities when the alarm sounded, and she immediately made her way to the bridge. "Report," she ordered as she entered. Lieutenant Marshall looked up from his station, his face pale. "4 cruisers have dropped out of FTL approximately 10,000 kilometers from our position. They are demanding that we surrender for inspection." "On what grounds?" "They claim we are trespassing in sovereign territory." Studied the tactical display. The 4 cruisers were arranged in a diamond formation around the horizon's edge, cutting off any obvious escape routes. Their weapons were not yet powered, but they could be activated in seconds. "Open a channel," she said. The face of the patrol commander appeared on the main screen. He was younger than X, his carapace still showing the deep purple color of youth. "Terran vessel, you are in violation of territorial law," the commander said. "You will power down your engines and prepare to be boarded." "This system was unclaimed when we began our survey," replied calmly. "We have no record of any territorial claim." "Ignorance is not an excuse. The claim was registered with the Assembly 20 years ago. You should have checked before entering." "We apologize for the misunderstanding. We will complete our survey and depart within 72 hours." "That is not acceptable. You will surrender immediately, or we will be forced to take action." Muted the channel and turned to her crew. "Analysis." Commander Daniel Brooks, her executive officer, shook his head. "Their weapons outclass ours significantly. If they decide to fire, we cannot win a direct engagement." "Can we outrun them?" "Their FTL drives are faster than ours. They would catch us before we could reach safe space." Considered her options. She could surrender and hope that the diplomatic fallout would be manageable. She could try to flee and risk being destroyed. Or she could stand her ground and see if they were really willing to fire on a human vessel. She thought about the 300 years of preparation. She thought about the billions of listeners spread throughout the galaxy, watching everything. She thought about the defensive networks, dormant but ready to activate at a moment's notice. She thought about all the generations of humans who had worked and sacrificed and died to bring them to this moment. And she made her decision. "Unmute the channel," she said. The commander's face reappeared on the screen. "Commander, I respectfully decline your demand to surrender. We are conducting a peaceful scientific survey of what we believe to be unclaimed territory. We have no hostile intentions and pose no threat to interests. We will depart as soon as our survey is complete. Until then, we will remain where we are." The commander's compound eyes widened slightly. No human had ever refused an assembly demand before. It was unprecedented. "You are making a serious mistake," he said. "If you do not comply, I am authorized to use force." "That would be inadvisable," replied. "If you fire on this vessel, you will trigger a response that neither of us wants." "Are you threatening me?" "No, Commander. I am simply stating a fact. Humanity has been patient for 300 years. We have endured your demands, your condescension, and your threats. We have done so because we wish to avoid conflict. But if you force our hand, you will discover that our patience has limits." The commander stared at her for a long moment. Then, without warning, a plasma bolt streaked across the bow of the horizon's edge, close enough to rock the ship with its passage but not close enough to cause damage. It was a warning shot. Did not flinch. She had been expecting this. She had been preparing for this her entire life. "That was a mistake," she said quietly. Then she turned to Marshall. "Open a secure channel to Terra Command. Authorization code, quiet protocol, full activation." His face went even paler as he realized what she was ordering. But his hands moved across his console without hesitation, entering the codes that would change everything. On the screen, the commander was shouting threats and demands. Ignored him. Her attention was on the display showing the status of human systems throughout the galaxy. One by one, they began to activate. The listeners started transmitting tactical data in real time. The defensive networks came online. The hidden fleets powered up their engines and began moving toward predetermined positions. And on 47 assembly military installations across 8,000 light-years, the exotic particle generators that had been secretly installed over the past century began to hum with power. The assembly had finally overstepped the bounds of offense. And Terra was no longer quiet.